Hey everyone, this is Josh Rosenau. I'm here with, you see Peter Hess and Chris Stedman on the screen with me. Sally Bingham should be with us momentarily. This is an NCSE webinar on building alliances with clergy and religious communities. I'm gonna moderate, but turn this over to the panelists shortly. I just want to do a few quick make sure everyone orientation for the webinar. So for all of you who are attendees and watching this remotely, there should be there are a few different ways that you can interact with me and the panelists. There's a button in your screen that looks sort of like a hand, and if you hit that, it'll say that it's the equivalent of raising your hand. It's of saying that you want to turn on your you want me to turn your microphone on and let you ask a question or make a comment. There is also a tab in the GoToWebinar control panel that says questions. And from there, you can type in a question that I will see. I can either forward the text to one of the panelists to answer offline, or I might type an answer. Alternatively, I'll just read the question off and let the panel discuss it. So we're going to start off. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and here's Sally. Excellent.
Hello.
So this is the
Hi,
gang.
Sally.
And in the background, you can hear my toddler, who doesn't have a great deal to say about religious outreach, but does clearly have a lot to say. So I'm gonna cut out here and mute my microphone so that so that you don't have to hear him unless you want to. And why don't we start? I think we decided we were going to start with Chris, or did we want to start with you, Peter?
Well, I can just introduce myself if that works.
Sure. I mean, do you need your slides, or do you want to?
No, I mean, no, I can.
Okay. Why don't we just run it sans slides and see how it goes?
Okay. Well, greetings to everyone. This is actually my first webinar, so if things are a bit shaky on my end, I'm going to be relying on Josh's help and Sally and Chris. I'm the outreach director to religious communities here at the National Center for Science Education, and I was brought on board in 2006 so that NCSE could have a presence with religious communities, both to let religious people know that evolution is their friend, and to let the scientific community know that most mainstream religious communities are on board with evolution, at least for the last half century. We have many issues that we deal with at the National Center for Science Education, including climate change, which we took on board a few years ago. So I see myself as providing an important bridge between the scientific community and the religious community, and helping to build coalitions, to invite religious communities who don't know that there are others involved with scientific issues like evolution and climate change, to enter into the dialogue, and where possible, to provide assistance in the case of local flare-ups. And so I'm very happy to be partnering here with Chris Stedman and Sally Bingham, who have much experience in terms of reaching out and building coalitions with other groups. So I think I'll leave that here at this point and invite Chris to introduce himself.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Peter. I'm very pleased to be a part of this conversation today. My name is Chris Stedman. I currently serve as one of two humanist chaplains at Harvard University, where I work to support an active community of atheists, agnostics, and the non-religious. And one of my key roles in this position is organizing initiatives that bring together atheists, agnostics, and the non-religious to work alongside religious communities for the common good. And some of these initiatives have focused on issues that that both our community is really passionate about and that many religious communities care deeply about as well, such as climate change, as one example of others. And I'm very excited to share some thoughts that I have on building these kinds of coalitions, and share a bit of our experiences in terms of how we've gone about doing that. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you. Sally, would you like to introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you
I
now.
can now, yes.
Oh, good. Okay. Because a little voice just came on and said unmuted, and I didn't know if I'm supposed to do something or not. But if you can hear me, I'm going. Just do something. If the sound goes off, put your hand up. Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
I am the Reverend Sally Bingham, and I run an organization called the Regeneration Project. And we have a campaign going on, a national campaign called Interfaith Power and Light. And the tagline is a religious response to global warming. So our focus is on climate change almost entirely. Everything we do out of this office has to do with what does the religious community's impact have on climate, and how do we get our congregations to understand that they have a moral responsibility for future generations, and therefore should put their faith into action and cut their own carbon footprints, the congregation itself cutting its carbon footprint and serving as an example to the community. I have always said and maintained that the scientists today are our prophets. They are today's prophets, and that we need to listen to them. We in the Episcopal Church I'm an Episcopal priest, we have no conflict with science. There are some religions that are suspicious of science, but most mainstream religions have accepted the science of climate change. And what we've done is really try to bring environmental stewardship to the forefront of mainstream religion, so that with love, justice, and peace, integrity of creation and saving creation is as important as any of those other sort of moral standards for the religious community. And we've had tremendous success. I mean, people who sit in the pews and profess a love for God, who say they love creation and say they love their neighbors, are the people that I really believe should be leading this movement. If we say we love God and we love each other, how can we stand by and watch creation be destroyed? And so that's what our platform is. And we have 15,000 congregations around the country now who have joined up to say, we agree, we want to be stewards of creation, and what do we need to do that? And then we provide the resources for congregations to either put solar on their roof, get energy efficient appliances, get people in their congregations to go home and do the same thing in their homes. And it's started a rather large religious movement to respond to climate change. And I welcome any questions that anyone might have on how we do this, how the success of it, and whatever else we do.
Thanks. And so, just for my purposes, Sally, did you cover everything that you had in the slides that you sent me, or did you still want to go through those at all?
Well, if you put the slides up, I think what it has on there is there's a couple of there's our mission statement of both the Regeneration Project and Interfaith Power and Light, and then how to contact us if any folks have any questions after this webinar is over, and whether or not are the other people using slides?
Peter has some.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly put them up, and I can just show. They're very brief, and it'll give some verbiage and a couple of pictures to what I've just said.
Okay. Let me just seeing if I can pull up Peter's slides also while I'm at this. Ah, there they are. So while I'm doing this, though, would any of you like to talk a little bit about some of the coalitions and work that you've done? Are there pitfalls that, as people who haven't been doing this for as long as you guys have, pitfalls that people should watch out for, or is this something that you shouldn't try at home? Is this something that is pretty straightforward for people to do? Uh, does anyone have any thoughts about that side of it? Oh, sorry, Peter, I've got you on mute. Hold on, let me unmute you. I will unmute all of you.
Oh,
okay, there you go.
Okay, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure what the signal was that we wanted to speak. I don't have a slide about this, but if it would be instructive, I could talk a little bit about some work I did with a school in San Francisco where I found that the constituents were speaking past each other. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that that's a huge challenge to overcome with these, that different religious traditions have refer to some of the same things using different language. And so I would think that there must be a lot of talking past. Well, how do you overcome that?
Well, let me just take a couple of minutes to explain what happened. In 2008, NCSE was approached by a young woman named Julia Arce from Convent of the Sacred Heart in San Francisco, because their school wanted to celebrate the Darwin Year by installing a comprehensive curriculum called Evolution Across the Curriculum, or the Darwin Project. And so in the course of the year 2008 to 2009, I was consulting with them and ended up doing some teaching over there and helping them put together a wonderful conference. But very early in this process, I think in December 2008, it became clear that the religious studies teachers were not really clued into what the science teachers were saying when they used terms like law, theory, hypothesis, fact. And it was very clear that some people on the science faculty had no idea what was meant by eschatology or theodicy or the problem of suffering. And so I decided to put together a PowerPoint presentation on building a common lexicon. And I took about 20 terms relevant to philosophy, theology, or science, and wrote down cursory descriptions of what theologians or scientists mean by this. So we had a wonderful day of dialogue in December of 2008 across all the departments, and people came away quite empowered and quite relieved to find out that they actually could speak the same language, and sometimes they were using a word like law very differently in science and in religion. So I found that even within one school, in one tradition, there was the tendency to speak past each other, and it was very helpful to have this seminar, this day of dialogue, to bring people into speaking the same language through the same common lexicon. So I'm thinking that if this circumstance applied in one Catholic school in San Francisco, how much more challenging might it be for you, Chris, to build coalitions across the atheist, free-thinking, agnostic traditions, and for you, Sally, to do the same thing across all the many denominations you deal with. And so I would suggest that we look at the question of how you build a common lexicon, particularly on an issue where everybody of goodwill already recognizes that climate change is going to be profoundly important for all of us. I see.
Yeah, Miles wants to jump in on this.
So who would like to address that issue?
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to respond briefly in that in my experience, having not started out with the intention of bringing world religions together, this has been a really wonderful kind of unintended consequence of doing climate work. I have been at tables with Jews, Hindus, Muslims, Baha'is, Christians, evangelicals, Roman Catholic, all in the room together agreeing that we are the stewards of creation. And that's been a very rewarding consequence of getting involved with environmental stewardship. And while there are some naysayers and some voices out there that might argue with that humans are, in fact, the ones that are influencing the climate, most mainstream religions are in agreement. And this has been, for me, quite rewarding. And I'm happy to say that we can bring all these religions together over this subject. They do agree that we're the stewards of creation. They might argue over who's causing the problem, whether God is the influential one here, or is going to preserve the planet because of the covenant that he made with Noah. But overall, my experience really all over the country has been that mainstream religions understand we are the stewards of creation. So my experience is a little different from yours, Peter, in that congregation you were in San Francisco.
And have you found that that's a
Chris, I think you were
conversation
going to speak, weren't you?
sorry, that people seem to want to be having, or do you have to drag them into it a little bit?
Well, we don't give them a choice. If we can have a congregation join our program, they sign a covenant where they agree to talk about climate change in their congregation. So if a clergy person is up in the pulpit, the folks in the pews are listening. They may not agree, but they are going to be listening to whatever the clergy person has to say on a somewhat regular basis. This is the benefit, I believe, of bringing the religious community into this conversation, because while they don't sign up, they're not members of the Sierra Club, but they do have a home in a congregation where they go on a regular basis, and then they are receiving the message. People don't ask the question, are you interested in this subject, before they listen to a sermon. They get whatever it is the clergy wants to say that Sunday. So they really, in my case anyway, we don't, well, wait, let me back up just a little bit. I'm going up to Sonoma tomorrow night to give a talk in a congregational church in the town of Sonoma. It's open to the public. Now, of course, those folks can decide whether they want to come or not. If that's what you mean, it'll be interesting to see what sort of a turnout shows up. But in a congregation, people don't get to choose what the subject's going to be that the clergy is going to talk about that day.
So this is a sort of central question in interfaith organizing, I would think. To what extent is it top-down? To what extent is the goal reach the clergy, convince the clergy to speak about these issues, and that the flock will follow? And to what extent is it effective to be reaching out to the community and having them, through official or unofficial church activities, bring that conversation to the fore? And I'm sure that each of you have. I'm curious how each of you would what experiences each of you have had with that.
Well, if you don't mind, I want to jump in. I can talk about that and also something Sally was saying. So, I think in response to your question, Josh, it's a both and. I think sometimes clergy can initiate and often do initiate this conversation in communities, and other times it comes from the community members who may be in some congregations or religious communities may be leading the way and may be further along than their leaders are. But something that Sally was talking about, I think, is really vital, a really vital aspect of this conversation, which is that in different religious communities, people speak a particular language. They use certain stories. They speak to a particular tradition, and this is one of the reasons why we have prioritized interfaith coalition building in our community so much, because that every community sort of speaks its own language. It reminds me of a personal story from my own experience, which is that a number of years ago, I had a kind of a falling out with one of my uncles. He is a creationist and is very religious, very a member of a non-denominational Christian community. And we had a falling out because I eventually arrived at a place where I felt that the differences between us were so vast that a conversation was not possible. And as the years have gone by, I've sort of come to regret that a little bit, but it's also reminded me that this is one reason why interfaith coalitions are so important, because I have a hard time speaking to them because I don't think of, I don't see the issue of climate change as being an issue of being my needing to be an agent, a steward of God's creation, because I don't believe in God. But I know that that is a conversation that's happening among Christians, and that perhaps allies of mine that are Christian that feel very strongly about this issue can speak to it in a way that I just cannot. And as someone who is an atheist, I know that I am in the minority in this country. And so building these coalitions is vital because it will amplify the voices of people who care about these issues. You need diverse people who can appeal to the different languages of communities. For example, I know a man who's doing a lot of really important work around climate change in the Muslim community, and he is able to talk about environmentalism from, he's able to speak out of the Muslim tradition. I just think that this is one of the most important aspects of this conversation, and knowing that religious communities are a profound source of social capital and people power. There's a great book for anyone who's interested in this subject that came out a few years ago called American Grace by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. It was an extensive study of the lives of religious Americans, and one of their findings that they reported on in this book is that religious Americans are a lot more civically engaged than the non-religious. So they give more money to charity, both religious charity and secular. They are more likely to volunteer in their community. They're more likely to run for political office. In the words of Putnam and Campbell, religious Americans are better neighbors than the non-religious. But they also found that a non-believing spouse of a religious person who participated in their partner's community was as likely to be civically engaged. And based on this finding, they speculated that communities, that the correlation between religiosity and civic engagement had more to do with belonging than with belief. It was about being a part of a community that could connect you to these issues, that would provide a space for you to speak about these issues. And that is our goal here in our community at Harvard, is to connect with local religious communities, to have conversations around what our shared values are and what our shared goals are, and then to work together toward those goals. And we've done a number of things around climate change. We've done a light bulb exchange where we partnered with a few organizations here in the community to go to various neighborhoods and offer to exchange their light bulbs for energy efficient light bulbs, and to also sign them up for evaluation so they could learn how to make their homes more energy efficient. We've done beach cleanups where we partnered with local organizations that are documenting what is found on the beaches and doing research on that. And so these are a few of the many different kinds of projects that we've done where we've partnered with religious communities, not only because we think that working with other communities makes our impact a lot larger, but also because everyone who participates in these efforts can then go back into their communities, and as Sally was saying, to be a voice for these issues within their own community because they've had this experience working with others. So that's just one thought that comes to mind. In terms of the value of building these coalitions, is that people in different communities really do speak different languages, and that it's important to have people who can speak to the values of various religious traditions.
And so there are a couple of people who have typed in questions asking about the dictionary and lexicon that Peter mentioned. Is there a copy of that around that we can post on the website for the webinar?
Well, it's in a PowerPoint. I don't know that I could without unplugging.
Well, we don't have to do it now. Yeah. So we'll post.
I can certainly make it available.
Yeah, we'll make that available on at NCSC's site under the Taking Action menu. You can find links to. You will find a recording of this conversation and past webinars as well, and we'll post the slides and any other resources that come up. Are there other, Chris and Sally, are there other lexicons of that sort or good universal translators or language that you found that works well across communities. Especially, I mean, I can imagine if I were trying to build an interfaith coalition of some sort, or to try to get, if I went to the Clergy Letter Project to find a congregation that I knew had a pro-evolution clergy member because I was looking for people to come with me to testify at a state house. I might still, even though I knew that we shared that respect for evolution, I might feel like I didn't have the right language to talk to that community about evolution because I wasn't part of their religious tradition. Are there ways to get past some of those stumbling blocks, the sort of the threshold issues, and have that conversation productively about evolution, about climate change, just across religious boundaries in general?
Can I step in here? I know you've asked Chris and Sally, but can I step in, Josh?
Of course.
Hello?
Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, okay. In a way, I think I'd like to distinguish between climate change and evolution in terms of the degree to which each of those issues is accessible. I was recently part of the San Francisco Archdiocese Ecumenical Meeting, which has people from many different denominations meeting annually. And one of the issues that came up in my questioning the speaker was the extent to which climate change really cuts across boundaries in a way that evolution doesn't. Because the evolution wars, if you want to put it that way, of the last century, the conflicts have hardened and calcified people's opinions to a certain extent in a way that climate change, which is a fairly new phenomenon on most people's religious consciousness, has not. In a sense, I was thinking about this morning while I was looking at the news about the rescue effort going on in Washington State to try to find victims of the landslide. It really is utterly irrelevant whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or an atheist. You get out there and you dig and you look for victims because life is the most important value. And I found in this discussion at the Ecumenical Commission that particularly with young people, and this may be a generational issue, but particularly with young people, the fact that we all inhabit this, all 7 billion of us inhabit a planet that's really in peril, seems to trump every other denominational or religious language consideration. That's not to say that we shouldn't build the lexicons and we shouldn't begin to learn how to talk, but I think, as Chris was saying, you do a beach cleanup, and you don't have a Muslim beach cleanup, and an atheist beach cleanup, and a Catholic beach cleanup. You're all out there cleaning up the beach. And so you meet each other, you rub shoulders, you learn what's important that you hold in common, and then perhaps you bring this broadened interfaith sensitivity back into your own community. So I think that can be very helpful to keep in mind.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll just jump in on that. I think that is one of the values of doing this kind of interfaith work, is that by starting with an issue that you know that you're in agreement on already, it creates an opportunity for you to develop a relationship that makes it easier to have those conversations where perhaps the agreement isn't already there. So I think that's something that's important to keep in mind, is that you're not necessarily going to be on the same side on every issue, but by recognizing that you have an issue that you both care about, that is an entry point into developing a relationship where perhaps it's a little bit more constructive to have some of the conversations about disagreements. And so this is something I was thinking about before this webinar today, is knowing that a lot of the work that I've done with different religious communities, for example, the reason we came together is because we agree that climate change is an important issue and that we want to do work together around it. But there were many of other issues that we did not agree on, whether it was evolution or a number of other issues. But through our relationships, we've had a chance to explore those other issues more in depth. And in a way that, for example, with my uncle, because I didn't put work into that relationship, I really wasn't able to have those conversations with him. And this is an area that I think, you can identify a shared concern, start there, and then move into something else. And in terms of the lexicon question, I mean, that I think is one of the things that prevents a lot of people from doing this kind of interfaith coalition building because they are concerned that they may say the wrong thing, or that they don't really know even the basic tenets of a particular tradition. And that's not at all surprising. Religious literacy rates in the United States are incredibly low. We know very little about religious traditions that we don't belong to. And so, but I actually think that this is one of the reasons why this kind of coalition building work is really important, because part of the goal of interfaith coalitions is for us to teach one another. It's an inherently educational endeavor. So I think it's okay, and this is something I've certainly done myself, it's okay to reach out to a religious community and to be very honest about the fact that you don't know very much about them, and to sort of own your ignorance and to ask for help, ask for assistance, say that you are interested in learning more and you just don't know. And this is one of the reasons why in our interfaith initiatives, we have one every month where we bring together people from different communities here to work together on a project. We always have the dialogue structured in such a way so that people are speaking for themselves rather than for one another. They begin by sharing some personal stories and getting to know one another a little bit in order to sort of humanize themselves to one another. And then from there, they move into these, into talking about the actual issue that we're working on. But it starts from a place of educating one another. And so I think it's okay to just admit that you perhaps don't know that much about this community, but I think a lot of communities, and this has been my experience, and it's certainly my experience when communities reach out to us, I think a lot of people are willing to share about their tradition, as long as you sort of admit up front that perhaps you don't know that much about it.
Yeah, I know I've found that people are generally...
So may I add something?
I'm sorry? Sorry, Sally, what's that?
Oh, I just said I can add something to this if you're...
Oh,
if you
please
want me
do.
to. Well, what I'm going to say is I'm in agreement with both Peter and Chris, and Peter particularly over the separation between the two subjects of evolution and climate change, because I don't think you can talk about them together for the reasons that he expressed. And Chris is right, too, about this community activity that people are inclined to, we crave each other, we crave relationship. And if all the people you're talking to believe that climate change is a serious issue and we need to do something about it, you're more likely to be open to how do we deal with climate change than if you're in a community where they're suspicious and are skeptical of the science. You tend to want to be in a community where you have shared values and think alike. And that brings up the shared values. When we talk about climate change in a community, in a congregation, we start with something that we can all agree on, which is that we'd like to have a safe, healthy planet for future generations. Everybody wants clean air, clean water, and land and a healthy environment. And if we start there with these shared values, then we can talk about, all right, how do we maintain that? How do we keep those things that we care about healthy and safe? In many cases, we are not invited to go in and talk to a congregation about climate change. But if we say, can we come in and talk to you about saving money on your energy bill? They say, yes, come in, and then we can talk about energy efficient appliances, putting solar on the roof, and how much money they're going to be saving, and then they can put that money out into the other ministries that they do. And nobody says, you can't come talk to us about how to save money. So unfortunately, that is one of the messages that we do carry with us, which is that all the things that one would do to combat climate change are the same things that we would do to help and keep a healthy future for the next generations. And we also talk about moral responsibility, and nearly all religions will carry that banner. Every major religion, every major cultural change in America has happened with religious leaders in the forefront. And you can go back to the abolition of slavery, to women's rights for education and to vote. And most recently in the civil rights movement, it was religious leaders talking about moral responsibility. And that's why, Chris, when you say that communities have different language, well, a lot of, the Muslims might say this differently from the Buddhists, from the Christians. However, they all agree that there's an interconnectedness, and that when the Buddhists say if you harm any part of the whole or any segment, you're harming the whole thing. Muslims say that God put the earth in balance, and it's their responsibility to keep it in balance. Christians and Jews say that God put Adam in the garden to till it and to keep it, and we are the gardeners. So in my experience, I have found that it isn't a complicated message for all major religions to say, yes, we are the stewards of creation. And while they may have detailed information that speaks differently, between Jews and Christians, obviously there's a big gap, and with the Muslims as well. But at the same time, they will all agree that they are the stewards of creation. So I don't think one has to have a special lexicon for the Muslims and one for the Jews and one's for the Christians. We have talking points on our website for all those different denominations and how to talk about climate change as a religious issue. So anybody who wants to look at our website can find, you can go to the Muslim section or the Jewish section or the Baha'i section. We've got a large group of Baha'is interested in doing good work on climate now too. So I will turn it back over to you.
Can I just add one thing there, Sally?
Yes, definitely.
And that is that my common lexicon was specifically for evolution, because I think there you do have people who, if they are not trained in science, have a very different understanding of law, probability, generalization, hypothesis, than people who are trained in science. And if you've got people trained in theology who look at terms like eschatology and theodicy and so forth, they're going to be using a language that is not common to scientists. I wanted to back up a little bit, though, and say, in response to what you were talking about with interfaith dialogue, I find that there's almost an intergenerational component here. I deal with Ben Lowe of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and I have a lot more in common as a Catholic with him than he does with his fellow Presbyterians in the Cornwall Alliance, who are of an older generation who utterly and completely deny climate change.
Right.
They're Presbyterians just as Ben Lowe is. So I'm wondering whether the younger generation, the people that you deal with, Chris, at in Harvard and the college community, have far more in common with each other, whether they're Christian or atheist or Baha'i, than the members of those communities have sometimes with their older generations. And I don't want to paint all people over 50, of whom I'm one, as dinosaurs who utterly reject climate change action. But we might want to pay attention in coalition building to how you take advantage of the fact that young people are speaking the same language across traditions that they might not even share with their own elders.
Yeah, I'm not, I can't say that I'm entirely familiar with any data that may exist about intergenerational differences, but I can speak to some of what you're saying, which is that I think, in fact, one of the things that I have seen come out of a lot of our interfaith events is a lot of people discovering that they may have more in common with someone of another tradition than they may have with some people who are part of their own community. And I think that giving people, if you create an event, an interfaith event addressing climate change, giving people from different communities the opportunity to articulate the source of their motivation is very wise, because it allows everyone in attendance to not only potentially hear someone who shares their motivation, if it's a member of their own community. It also gives people the opportunity to discover threads of agreement with someone from a different tradition or a different worldview, and to recognize that there may be some commonality there, like you're saying, Peter. So, if we have an event talking about climate change where we're doing a service project and we're having a dialogue as a component, I, as an atheist, might say, part of why I'm motivated to do this is because I believe that it's unlikely that there are any divine or supernatural forces that are going to intervene in human affairs and solve our problems for us. And therefore, it's up to us as human beings to address these problems, including climate change, and to work together across lines of religious difference in order to do so, knowing that one community alone can't solve these problems. And when I say that, I've had a number of religious people, a number of theists approach me afterwards and say, our motivation, the source of our motivation is different, but I really agreed with a lot of what you said, or a lot of what you said really resonated with my view. Except in my worldview, it is God that calls us to do this work. But the important thing is that we agree that doing the work is the important thing. It's Pope Francis made a comment to this effect last year, where he commented on how atheists and people of faith can meet in doing good with one another. And I do think that the motivation is important, and it's important to have a conversation about why we care about the things we care about. And I think it's really valuable to learn about why various communities see this as an important issue. But ultimately, the most important thing for me is that we arrive in the place of agreement in terms of seeing this as an important issue and doing that work together. And so when it comes to this lexicon, I think we can overcomplicate this sometimes, worrying that we don't. Oh no, did I lose audio? Or are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you. You're okay, Chris. Fire away.
Hello? Sorry.
You're okay, Chris.
I'm having some technical difficulties over here. I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, worrying about wanting to make sure that we know everything about a particular tradition. But this is where, again, I think it's really valuable to have people who are involved in this kind of work who represent a variety of different traditions. We always say, if we want to have a diverse group of people participate in this, then we need to have diverse people involved in organizing this from the beginning. Not only because they could reach out to various communities, but they can help us structure the event in such a way so that all of these different perspectives are represented. And so I think that if you are sort of thinking about wanting to organize an interfaith dialogue or an interfaith service project or an interfaith initiative around climate change or around evolution, make sure that one of your first steps is to reach out to different faith communities and identify someone within that community who wants to help put this together, because having people from diverse traditions involved in the planning from the beginning will make it much more likely that you'll get a diverse turnout for the actual event itself. So that's something that we have really emphasized in our work here is assembling a committee of people who represent a variety of different traditions who are involved in planning our events.
So I've got a few questions here from the people have typed in. I'm just going to throw them out there for discussion. Not even sure what order to take these in necessarily, but this one is a little bit different direction from what we've been talking about, but I think it's really crucial to a lot of these issues. Gordon Maupin asks, treatment of religious views of evolution and climate change in the mainstream media seems to only reflect Christian fundamentalists. I know people in mainstream religion who feel Christians must be anti-science on these issues because that's all they hear. Their own pastors don't care to address these issues. So what are your thoughts on how to get mainstream religion to communicate a view that's not fundamentalist, and to get those and I'll add, how do we get those voices better represented in the media, in state legislatures when there's testimony to be had, in school board meetings when there's testimony to be had? How do we, I think moderates by their natural inclination are not as loud as people at the extremes. So how can we help give them a microphone?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we organize these interfaith coalitions, for precisely that reason, because we live in a culture where voices of conflict rise to the top and have disproportionate influence, where you can look at a group like the Westboro Baptist Church, for example, a tiny congregation of less than 100 people that is extremely fundamentalist and not at all representative of the majority of Christians, and yet who has this disproportionate influence in the discourse around homosexuality in the United States and in much of the world. And this definitely colors our perception of the views of religious communities on various issues, and this was demonstrated in a recent study that was released by the Public Religion Research Institute that found that people in religious communities overestimate opposition to same-sex marriage within their communities by at least 20%. For example, I think over 75% of Catholics in the U.S. believe that other Catholics oppose same-sex marriage, when in fact more Catholics support same-sex marriage than the percentage among the general public. So there is this disconnect, and I think one of the things that we can do to challenge this, and I'd love to hear thoughts from you, Peter, and from you, Sally, is developing these coalitions that can speak out in solidarity, and because our voices are less likely to be heard if we're speaking out individually. But if we develop these coalitions, we are better positioned to challenge these voices of conflict that are much more likely, these extreme perspectives that are privileged in our culture and come to represent the views of a particular community, even when in actuality they don't.
Sally, do you want to go first on this?
Well, and I'll probably be pretty brief, but some of that question had to do with media coverage, and I believe that the media like the extremes because it gets attention. And as Chris is saying, those extremes don't represent the mainstream voices. And we have, I think it's 68,000 people on our in our network, and when we put out a call to talk to legislators about cutting carbon emissions, these folks respond, and maybe the mainstream groups are not getting the attention they need, but I will go back to saying that in my experience, traveling all over this country and preaching in congregations of different denominations, I would say that the majority of Americans believe that the climate change problem is real, and even within the religious community. And we have evangelicals who are on our team, and you all may know that Richard Cizik, he ran the National Association for Evangelicals. He was their lobbyist for 28 years. He has a whole coalition of the right-wing conservatives who are working on climate change. And I do think that maybe we need to give some help to the media that they are not representing the mainstream groups. And I think that has been a problem on climate change in general, that they write these stories helping the skeptical people to think that maybe the science is still undecided, which is really unfair. I mean, if 97% of the world's greatest scientists say that the climate change is a problem and that humans are causing it, and then a journalist wants to find the one or two voices that disagree with that and make it look like a balance, that's almost irresponsible and immoral from my perspective. And so I think we maybe need to have a conference with the media and try to help them understand that they're as much a part of the problem as the fossil fuel industry if they don't start reporting correctly on the facts that the scientists have put out for us. So that's my 2 cents on the media.
Well, I'll just back you up, Sally, because I was actually going to say the same thing. That I think the media for maybe a century has been fed the line that we have a narrative of conflict, and there's always got to be a conflict. And the job of the media is to find the via media between the two, find the middle position. I saw well, something that has been going around Facebook is a graphic that says that if 97% of bridge engineers say the bridge up ahead is going to collapse, and 3% disagree, who are you going to believe?
Yeah.
Which is a very nice way, a graphic way of putting what you just said about climate change. So I absolutely endorse your concern to have media workshops to educate them to the fact that you don't find the truth by finding the balance between 97% of consensus and 3% of extremes. And that's true, Chris, if you're talking about the Westboro Baptist Church. The other thing I was going to say is that something that Josh brought up about congregations. I think a lot of people are quite passive. They don't take the responsibility for helping to move their own clergy beyond. Some clergy are very educated. A few years ago, I was asked to teach the lead-off seminar at Pittsburgh Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and I had a wonderful class of 10 Doctor of Ministry students who were in a specialization on science and religion. 6 of them Presbyterian, 3 of them United Church of Christ, and 1 Congregationalist. And these were amazingly dynamic men and women. But many of them said that their own fellow clergy in their own synods or dioceses or whatever bodies they have was like trying to get an oil tanker moving to get them to understand. So it seems to me that congregations do have to take the lead in pushing their clergy, and those clergy who are already clued in to the importance of science and scientific perspectives need to be given help in moving their own fellow clergy of their denominations.
So we've got a question. John, oh, looks like he logged out. There was someone who had wanted to ask a question, but now it looks like he has disconnected, so he can't. But there are a few other questions that I wanted to get to. One of them is asking, in terms of when we talk about shared values, actually, yeah, I'm going to come at this a slightly different way. Somehow I answered. I'm sorry. I'm looking around a little bit here. Yeah, so it was actually John Aliff who had asked this before, who had wanted to speak, and I guess he's signed off. But he's the editor of the Georgia Journal of Science, and has been working on keeping the idea of scientific creationism out of school science classes. And he says from the beginning, not capital B beginning, from the beginning of his efforts, not the beginning of Genesis, the demand from them has been that the Bible must be scientifically correct. And I think that also comes up to some extent in talking about climate change, that there are people who take the stewardship message from a later section of Genesis, and there are people who take a dominion message, right? That we're given dominion and we can do whatever we want. In the same way that there are some people who look at the creation account in Genesis and say, this is 6,000 years ago, 6 24-hour days, everything was created. And there are other people who read that in a different way. To what extent is it useful and productive to try to, at what point are those gaps too great? At what point does it stop being productive to try to reach across them? At what point are there not enough shared values there that's a conversation worth having with that congregation?
I'll respond just very quickly because that dominion word is such a buzz for me. Dominion does not mean dominate and abuse. And to steal something from Matthew Sleeth, he said, we all have, God has dominion over us. We have dominion over every living thing. We as parents have dominion over our children. Teachers have dominion over their students. And that translates to stewardship in the sense that if we're a teacher, we want our students to be the best they can be. If we're a parent, we want our children to do as well as they can. We don't break their arms and crush their ribs. We help them be the best they can be. That's the dominion that God gave to us. Dominion was to care for and take care of creation. And whoever interpreted that to mean dominate and abuse is just plain wrong.
And so is it worth and there are people who do that, just as there are people who I would say wrong. I think we can all agree wrongly read the opening verses of Genesis as requiring a supernatural creation 6,000 years ago in 6 24-hour periods. My guess is that it's probably not worth trying to do a lot of outreach to someone who disagrees with you about how that dominion language should be interpreted. Someone who insists that dominion means dominate. That there's not enough common ground to have that conversation, or do you have to come at the conversation differently?
Are you asking me that?
Any of you? I'm curious. I'm curious for all of your thoughts.
Well, I haven't come up against anyone who would say, once you describe dominion as a role of stewardship or care for, people don't turn around and say, oh no, it doesn't mean that. It means we get to take all the resources we want, and we can actually harm other people by taking these resources. We can continue to put carbon pollution in the air, even if it poisons people, because God gave us the opportunity to do that. That to me is an uneducated argument, and a very selfish one. Peter probably knows more about that than I do.
Yeah, I think you're quite right, Sally, about how it would be very difficult to make the case against climate change action. And thinking about Josh's question, or the question he articulated from the listener, I would be loath to say there's ever a point at which I would simply write someone off and say you cannot learn, although I can certainly understand why people would say we've reached the end of productive dialogue. But let me give you an example. There's a Facebook group that I belong to called Celebrating Creation Through Natural Selection. And it's largely a group of theistic evolutionists who are interested in articulating the meaning of evolution for theological questions, like how do you think of the problem of suffering or of the end of the world in light of an evolutionary universe, a 13.7 billion-year-old universe. Now, many of our members, I've always been a theistic evolutionist myself, but many of our members were young Earth creationists who, through gentle conversation, gradually came to see to be a completely pro-evolutionary position, and they would not have made that leap had the conversation not allowed them to ask probing questions. We do, of course, although I shouldn't say we, I'm not one of the administrators, there are 6 administrators, and they have terminated people's commenting privileges on a number of occasions, because it was clearly a young Earth creationist coming on simply to proselytize for yuckism, and the administrators who said this is not profitable to the goals of the group to describe the implications of evolution for religious belief, and so their posting privileges are terminated. But I guess I always want to be open to change, particularly when you're talking about a congregation. Certainly in many traditions, the pastor or priest does not have the final say. Many congregations are much more congregationally driven. And so I would want to keep open the possibility that people in those congregations can come to see the importance of addressing climate change, even if they have to drag their pastors kicking and screaming into it.
So we've been running for about an hour now, and I'm happy to keep going.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to keep going.
Oh no, that's okay.
But we should. I do. I need to, like as you some of you noticed before. I do have my toddler here, and he needs to have lunch and have a nap. Some of you may also need to do that. So we probably should start winding down. But I want to give a chance for some concluding thoughts. And if I can insert myself into this, not as a interfaith organizer personally, but sort of summarizing some of what I've heard here that I think especially carries across from some of the webinars we've done on media skills and lobbying, the importance of building relationships and of being open to people, not that it can be scary to talk to people who you don't necessarily share a lot of background with. But I've always found that religious groups, that people want to share where they're coming from, that there's not, and if people aren't, then they may not be open to the other conversation either. As a long-term effort, it might be worthwhile, but as in terms of sort of efficient use of time, there may be more productive places to start those conversations. Things like the Clergy Letter Project, the Clergy Climate Letter that Peter and some colleagues are working on launching, groups like the Interfaith Power and Light where you've got listings of people who have already said, we agree with you on this issue, something like evolution, something like climate change, can be the best place to start those conversations, even if they can then continue. I don't think anyone's mentioned local interfaith councils, and I don't know if any of you have found those to be useful places to start conversations like this. But I would imagine that if someone is trying to build something locally, if their Citizens for Science group is trying to do more outreach to faith communities in the area, I would imagine that local interfaith councils would be a great way to start those conversations with the leading local clergy. And if any of you have had experiences with those sorts of conversations and can share tips on how to get that started, that would be great in these last few minutes also. But just really not being afraid to start the conversation and to find those shared values. It's the same thing that we say when we're talking about lobbying. Look at the legislators who are influential. Where are they coming from? What's important to them? The same way with clergy and with congregations. Where are they coming from, and try to meet them halfway. I think really carries across, whether it's interfaith organizing or political organizing or probably labor organizing, which I have even less experience with. So if you have any other responses or thoughts on sort of last thoughts for our audience here, that'd be great. And then we should probably let everyone get back to their worth.
Yeah, I would just agree with you, Josh, that I think a great place to begin is with pre-existing organizations that may already have a lot of these connections. And if there isn't an interfaith organization or interfaith council in your community, I think it really is as simple as just beginning to reach out to some of the congregations and finding out who may be interested. And we found with our organizing here that a lot of it is just critical mass. Once you get one or two faith communities involved, then others begin to see what you're doing as more legitimate, or they're intrigued by what you're doing and they want to get involved as well. And all of our programs have grown over the period of time that we've been doing them, because from the beginning we had a few faith communities involved, and then they've sort of grown in number from there. And a lot of these faith communities have relationships with other communities, whether they've participated in some sort of initiative in the past or something like that. And so I would just say that, it's always worth it to reach out, even if you end up hitting a roadblock, because as long as you continue to keep trying to reach out, you will find people who are interested in doing this, and who are interested in working with you on these things. And those are the folks, those allies, those relationships can be really instrumental, in the sense that, when we were talking about this question of dominion, as an atheist, it's not an issue that I can really speak to in the same way that a Christian can. And so I'm grateful to have people who are working in Christian communities who are having those conversations, who are speaking that language. And I think that's just one of many reasons why this can be really important work. And I would encourage everyone who's participating in this webinar to seek out what resources already exist in their communities, as well as to reach out to congregations and get that conversation started. And I just want to reiterate my gratitude to all of you for participating in this and for letting me share some thoughts, and my thanks to Peter and Sally for the great work that you're doing.
Thank you. Sally?
Well, let's see. We have had great success with interfaith councils locally. They actually had California Interfaith Power and Light be focused at the prayer breakfast that they do every year and they have public officials that come to that event as well. And they've been very supportive. The main religious leaders here in San Francisco are pretty much on board. Now, this is California, it is San Francisco, so we have a progressive community where I would say most folks understand that we have to respond to climate change. And so for me, locally, it's not an uphill battle. It could perhaps be in Alabama, but even our folks down there are having some pretty good luck with, as I talked about earlier, those shared values. And the only thing I would say with folks organizing an interfaith community, you don't have to have everybody. What we need is, and Chris used these words, we need a critical mass to turn this thing around. We don't need every single person. And sometimes if there is a lot of resistance, that it's almost not worth arguing for any long period of time. If you find that somebody's issues are politically motivated, sometimes you just can't you can't change their minds. I think we need to work with the emotions and the hearts of people in which when we talk about moral responsibility in the future. But I wouldn't say that we need everyone. If there's resistance, go on to the next people, and because there will be acceptance, and just keep trying.
So my concluding thoughts would be to, building on what Sally and Chris have said. Sally, you talk about shared values. In Berkeley, we have an interfaith council that decided a number of years ago, before I actually moved to Berkeley, I moved there in 1995, and I found that our parish, St. Mary Magdalene Parish, participates in homeless dinners, and we take the second and fourth Sunday of every month. And we feed the homeless. And in response to what Chris said, we don't articulate our desire or our need to feed the homeless by whether we have a dominionist or stewardship perspective. We just do it because they're hungry and because it's the right thing to do. And I'm sure that atheists and agnostics and Baha'i and Jews and Christians have different reasons for why we'd be feeding the hungry. But the fundamental reason is because they're fellow human beings who need a meal. So I agree, we don't have to start with a fully articulated program and with everybody on board. We need a nucleus of people. Just sort of a final thought about how to approach the climate change issue. In some ways, I think it is so enormous that it's difficult to know where to begin. You're not going to have a small group of local clergy say, okay, these are the issues, how can we combat 300 feet of sea level rise or 160 feet of sea level rise by the year 3000. That's a magnitude way greater of a problem than we can think in our lifetimes. But recently I was participating in organizing a group for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's March on Washington with a group of black clergy here in the Bay Area. And I just met some very interesting people. A woman working in Hunters Point, South San Francisco, which is a highly toxic area, and working on the issue of environmental racism. And another person who joined that coalition was a Hispanic person from Richmond, where we have a lot of refineries. And so from an interfaith perspective, including believers, non-believers, and so forth, we were all tackling this one problem. How can we deal with environmental racism? How can we work on the issue that environmental burdens are differentially and disproportionately shared across the population. And lots of interesting discussions and coalitions came about from this. So I think perhaps starting locally and very specifically is the best way to begin to tackle the really macro issues.
All right. Well, thank you all. There's one attendee who has his hand up who wanted to ask a question or make a comment, but I think we should probably wrap up. But feel free to email Mike Zawoski is who that is. If you want to send me an email, and I can forward it on to the rest of the panelists. I'm sorry for leaving you hanging there. Everyone who attended will get an email with a survey for what you thought of the webinar and what suggestions you have for the future. I hope you'll all fill that out. Some people have been giving me feedback through the question feature already, and that's great. But please do fill out that survey, and please do come back for future webinars that we're going to do on advocacy for great science education. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you for everyone who attended and participated. It's been a great conversation, and one that I'm sure will not end now, although this webinar will.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.